The autumn ball at Ashmore Park had not yet reached its second hour when Lord Edmund Vane raised his voice above the violins and pronounced, with the measured confidence of a man accustomed to being believed, that his son's marriage was a fraud. Cecily heard it from across the room. She was standing near the long windows, holding a glass of negus she had not tasted, watching the candlelight catch the diamonds on Miss Arabella Ford's throat, and the words reached her through two conversations and the rustle of a dozen silk skirts as clearly as if Edmund had been standing at her elbow. "A nobody," he said. "Married out of spite, not judgment. A vicar's daughter with debts and no prospects, elevated to duchess for the sole purpose of embarrassing a father who had tried, with great care and at considerable personal expense, to arrange something better." The room absorbed this, the way a pond absorbs a stone. A brief disturbance, a spread of rings, and then a great many faces turned toward Cecily Hartwell, now the Duchess of Ashmore, standing alone by the windows in a gown of deep green silk that was the finest thing she had ever worn, and still plainly not fine enough for this company. She did not flinch. She had learned, in the 5 months since her father's death and the 4 that followed inside this marriage, that flinching gave the room something to talk about. She set the glass down carefully on the nearest table and folded her hands and waited for Marcus to say something. He did not. He was 20 feet away, speaking with a man from the county bench, and his face was still and cold as carved stone, and he did not move. What she did not yet know, in that moment of terrible stillness, was that everything she had come to believe about herself inside the walls of this house was about to be confirmed by the only person whose confirmation had ever, against all her intentions, begun to matter. This is how it had begun. Reverend Giles Hartwell had died in April of 1814, on a Tuesday, during a cold that became a fever, that became, in the space of 9 days, the end of everything. He was 61 years old, and he had been the vicar of Wrentham in Hertfordshire for 23 of those years, and he had raised his daughter to believe that a person's worth was not a thing the parish registry could record. He had also left her, as the solicitor missed her. Fossey confirmed in his study on the Thursday after the funeral, with a debt of £430, composed of physician's fees and the costs of interment, and a small unpaid sum to the chandler on the High Street that her father had been too proud to mention in life. Cecily was 23 years old. She had no brothers. The living passed to another man. The house went with the living. She had a trunk, a winter coat that had been retrimmed twice, and a letter of introduction to a distant cousin in London who received it with the polite anxiety of a person who could not quite afford to help and could not quite bring herself to refuse. The cousin's name was Mrs. Adela Foss, and she lived in a narrow house in Bloomsbury, and she brought Cecily to the first ball of the 1814 season with the particular mixture of generosity and apology that characterized everything she did. The gown was borrowed. The gloves were a half-size too small and left red marks at Cecily's wrists. The rooms were bright and enormously loud, and within the first quarter hour, Cecily heard herself described by a woman in yellow satin who had not noticed her standing 2 feet behind the potted fern as that penniless Hartwell girl, the vicar's orphan, the one with the debt. She did not correct the woman. She straightened her spine and moved toward the supper room, where at least the air was cooler, and told herself it was merely the first evening of what would be a long season. Marcus Vane, the Duke of Ashmore, was not at that first ball. He was at the third, standing alone near the terrace door with the particular stillness of a man who attends these events because his rank requires it, and who has long since stopped pretending to enjoy them. He was 34 years old, dark-haired, with a jaw that looked as though it had been set against some long resistance and simply never relaxed. His eyes were gray, the specific gray of winter light on stone, and they moved across the room with a flat efficiency that registered everything and lit upon nothing. Cecily noticed him the way one notices a cold draft from a window that cannot be identified. Present. Unavoidable. Probably not directed at her specifically. She was wrong about the last part, though she would not have believed it for some time. The conversation that changed the architecture of her life happened not in the ballroom, but on the pavement outside it, at 20 minutes past 11, when she had gone out to collect herself after a particularly pointed exchange with Mrs. Delaford, a woman of considerable social confidence who had suggested, in a voice calibrated to Carrie, that Cecily might find better use of her time in a schoolroom than a drawing room, given her father's profession and her present circumstances. Marcus was at the foot of the steps, waiting for his carriage, when Cecily came through the door. He looked at her precisely once, and then looked away. And she was gathering herself to descend the steps, when his voice came out of the near dark, with no preamble at all. "You were at the Greenfields last week." She turned. "I was, Your Grace. My father spoke to you." It was not a question. She answered it honestly regardless. "He introduced himself. He mentioned that you were in need of a suitable duchess, and that he had taken a personal interest in the matter." A silence in which the carriage lamps threw gold light across the pavement stones. Then Marcus said, "He has been taking a personal interest in the matter for 3 years. The interest has become oppressive." Cecily said nothing. She recognized, from long practice in a vicarage full of people telling her things they needed a witness to, that he was not asking for her opinion. He confirmed this by saying, very levelly, "I have a proposal to put to you, Miss Hartwell. Not a romantic one. A practical arrangement that would serve both our purposes. You have a debt of £430 and no particular position. I have a father who will not stop attempting to install a woman of his choosing in my household. A marriage on paper between us would retire your debt at once and obstruct his current scheme, which has reached a pitch of inconvenience I am no longer prepared to endure." Cecily looked at him for a long moment. The two tight gloves pressed into her wrists, and a violin somewhere above them was playing the beginning of a reel. "You are asking me to marry you," she said, "in order to spite your father. I am asking you to enter a legal arrangement that benefits us both." He paused. "The spite is incidental." She understood that it was not incidental. She understood also that £430 was not a sum she had any other means of retiring, and that the season stretched before her like a corridor with no door at the end. She thought of her father, who had taught her that a bargain was honest if both parties named their terms plainly, and that there was no shame in accepting a fair one. "I accept," she said, "on the condition that I am permitted to manage whatever household I am placed in according to my own judgment." He studied her face with those gray eyes for a moment that lasted slightly longer than it should have. Agreed. They were married 3 weeks later in a small church in Kensington, with Mrs. Foss and Marcus's solicitor as witnesses, by a licensed minister who had no apparent feelings about the matter, one way or another. Cecily wore the green gown, which was the second finest thing she owned, and carried a small bunch of white flowers that Mrs. Foss had pressed into her hands at the door. Marcus was in dark blue and did not smile, but he placed the ring on her finger without hesitation and said the words as though he meant every one of them, which Cecily found, despite herself, briefly disorienting. Ashmore Park was 60 miles northwest of London, and large enough that a person could spend a week inside it without revisiting the same room twice. The house stood at the end of a long avenue of elms, 3 stories of pale stone against the Hertfordshire sky, and the grounds ran to a kitchen garden, a walled orchard, a lake, and lawns that had been allowed to grow slightly longer than was fashionable. The housekeeper, Mrs. Peel, met her at the front door with a curtsy and a face that gave away nothing but a single brief look of assessment, the kind a person gives a new quantity they are not yet sure how to measure. Cecily was shown to a suite of rooms that had been opened and aired, but not redecorated, and she thanked Mrs. Peel with specific gratitude for the fire that had been lit and the water that had been brought. And when the housekeeper offered to arrange for the housemaids to rearrange the furniture according to the new Duchess's preferences, Cecily said simply that she would like a day or two to understand the rooms before she moved anything in them. Mrs. Peel's expression shifted by approximately 1/4 of an inch in the direction of something that might, in a more expressive person, have been approval. The child she met on her 3rd morning. Thomas was 8 years old, slight for his age, with dark eyes like his uncle's, and the specific quality of stillness that belongs to children who have learned that adults are not always safe to approach. He was Marcus's ward, established so by the will of Marcus's younger brother Edward, who had died at Salamanca in the summer of 1812, and left the boy with no mother living, and an uncle he had met perhaps twice. Cecily found Thomas in the long gallery, seated on the floor beneath a portrait of a woman in blue, pressing his thumb into the carpet fibers in neat, systematic rows, and she sat down on the floor beside him and said nothing for several minutes. Then she asked if he knew what the woman in the portrait was called. He glanced at her sideways. "Lady Catherine," he said very quietly. "She was the first Duchess. She died." Cecily looked at the portrait. The woman was fair-haired and graceful, and held herself with the ease of someone who had never had reason to doubt she belonged exactly where she was. "She looks like someone who was kind," Cecily said. Thomas considered this. "Uncle Marcus doesn't like to look at her." Cecily made a note of this and did not ask him anything more about it. The schoolroom was on the 2nd floor, a high-ceilinged room that smelled of chalk dust and neglect, with a good north light and a fireplace that had been laid but not lit. Thomas's tutor was a Mr. Crane, a thin, irritable man of middle years who had been employed by Edmund rather than by Marcus, and who ran the schoolroom according to principles that appeared to involve a great deal of silence and a great deal of the threat of the cane. Cecily observed this from the corridor on her 4th day, and said nothing. On the 5th day, when she heard Crane's voice rise to the particular pitch that precedes a blow, and heard Thomas's sharp intake of breath that followed, she opened the schoolroom door. Crane turned. Thomas was standing at the board with his head down, his left hand pressed against his side in the way of a child accustomed to absorbing pain quietly. Cecily looked at the tutor with a steadiness she had learned at the bedsides of people who were frightened and needed someone not to be. "Leave the room, please," she said. Crane stared at her. "Your Grace, the child has failed 3 consecutive exercises and refuses to attend to correction. I did not ask your reason. I asked you to leave the room." There was a moment in which it was possible to see Crane calculate his position and find it insufficient. He left the room. Thomas stared at the floor. Cecily crossed the room, looked at the exercises on the board, and discovered that 2 of the 3 were in fact correct, and the 3rd contained an error that was not Thomas's, but the textbook's, which had a misprint on page 47 that no one had thought to check. She explained this to Thomas in a matter-of-fact tone, correcting the problem on the board beside him. He watched her hand move across the slate with a careful attention that was not yet trust, but was adjacent to it. She did not know that Marcus was standing in the corridor. She did not know that he had come up to the schoolroom specifically because he had heard Crane's voice from the floor below and had not yet decided what to do about it, and that he arrived at the doorway precisely in time to watch his wife tell a grown man to leave a room and mean it, and then sit beside his ward and explain a problem in the quiet, practical voice of someone who has all the time in the world. Mrs. Peel was behind him, carrying a stack of clean linens for the airing cupboard. She observed him observing Cecily. She said nothing. She filed it carefully. The portrait of Catherine was in the east corridor on the second floor, and it had been turned to face the wall. Cecily found this on a Wednesday in early July, when she was walking the house in the early morning, before the household was fully awake, which had been her habit in Wrentham, and which Ashmore Park, for all its size and grandeur, seemed to accommodate without complaint. She stood in front of the reversed canvas and looked at the plain wooden back of it for a moment, and then she went to find Marcus. He was in the study, which was the room he inhabited most consistently, a large, austere room with 2 tall windows looking onto the park and walls lined with books that had been read rather than arranged for appearance. He was at his desk, already dressed, papers before him, and he looked up when she entered. "There is a portrait in the east corridor that has been turned to the wall," Cecily said. A stillness came over him that was different from his ordinary stillness. "I am aware." She sat down across from him, which was not something she ordinarily did without being invited, and he watched her do it with an expression that was difficult to read. "I am not asking you to change it," she said. "I only wanted to know whether it was your instruction or someone else's." He was quiet for long enough that she began to think he would not answer. Then he said, "Her name was Catherine. She died 3 years ago, in childbed. The child also died." He paused. "Thomas's father, my brother Edward, had gone to the war 2 months before. I was here." Another pause. Shorter. "I should have sent for the physician sooner. I did not, because she said she was well, and I believed her, because I needed to believe her. That is the whole of it." He said these 4 things in a voice that had been stripped of everything that was not fact, the way a man speaks when he has said something many times inside himself and has finally made it small enough to say aloud. Cecily sat with it for a moment. "I am sorry," she said. "That is a grief that has no adequate answer." He looked at her. Really looked. The way he had not permitted himself to do since the night on the pavement. Then he picked up his pen and said, "Is there anything else?" There was not. She left him to his papers and walked back down the east corridor and did not touch the portrait, because it was not hers to restore. Not yet. If you have found yourself settling into this story, the comment below is a good place to say so, and to stay for whatever comes next. The weeks that followed were a kind of quiet accumulation, the sort that does not seem significant in any individual moment, and which only reveals its weight when you try to measure how far you have traveled from where you started. Cecily read aloud to Thomas in the evenings, from the natural history volumes she found in the schoolroom, and then, as his confidence expanded toward hers, from the novels in the library that he was technically too young for, but which held him perfectly still for 40 minutes at a time. She replaced Crane with a young man from the village, a Mr. Sherwood, who had a mathematics degree from Cambridge and a patient manner, and who had been working as a clerk for want of a better position. She managed the household's accounts with the same precise attention her father had applied to the parish records, and she found, after 2 weeks of study, a recurring overcharge from the butcher in the market town that amounted to 16 shillings per month, and which Mrs. Peel confirmed had been present in the ledger for at least 3 years. Marcus was told this at supper one evening in a quiet report of the household's affairs, and he looked across the table at her with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite something else, and said, "You reviewed the accounts yourself." "I did. I hope that was not presumptuous." It was not. Another evening, near the end of July, she found him at the piano in the music room. Not playing, only sitting at the bench with one hand resting on the keys as though he had meant to begin, and had not managed to. She passed through the room on her way to the library, and she did not speak, but as she reached the door, she said, without turning, "The tuning is slightly off on the upper register. I noticed it when Thomas was playing yesterday. I can send for the instrument tuner in the morning, if you would like." "Yes," he said after a beat. "Thank you." In the garden, in mid-August, they were walking the path along the walled orchard when she stumbled on a loose stone, and his hand was at her elbow before she had fully registered the stumble, steadying her with a grip that was neither tentative nor excessive. And when she straightened and he released her, neither of them mentioned it, but the air between them for the rest of the walk had a quality it had not had before. In the darkened corridor outside the library, on a night in late September, when she had gone to return a book, and he had been there ahead of her, standing in the near dark with a candle, having apparently reached the same destination from the opposite direction, they stood for a moment no more than 3 feet apart, and he said, "I find I am not certain what I planned," and she said very quietly, "No, nor am I." He stepped back. She moved past him into the library. Her hand was not quite steady on the shelf where she replaced the book. Edmund came in October. He arrived without warning on a Thursday morning, accompanied by Lady Dorothea and Miss Arabella Ford, who had apparently been brought along as a kind of argument made visible. Dorothea, the dowager, was a tall, composed woman in her late 50s, who wore her self-possession like a second set of clothing, and who greeted Cecily at the door of the drawing room with the precise blend of courtesy and diminishment that marks a true practitioner of social hierarchy, the kind that smiles and still manages to convey that the person being smiled at is, at best, an inconvenience. "My dear girl," Dorothea said, taking Cecily's hands in both of hers and holding them for a fraction too long. "You have made yourself quite at home. How industrious." Edmund was shorter than his son, softer in his edges, and had the face of a man who believed in his own intelligence with a completeness that had never been seriously tested. He looked at Cecily with the frank appraisal of someone examining a document that has been substituted for the original, and found it unsatisfactory. "A country vicar's daughter managing Ashmore," he said to Dorothea, as though Cecily were not present. "The season will have something to say about that." Arabella said nothing. She was very beautiful, in the specific manner of a woman who has been told so many times that she has forgotten it is not a virtue, and she watched Cecily with eyes that held a complex of emotions Cecily could not quite decipher, though she thought one of them, in the back somewhere, might have been something almost like pity. Marcus was civil to his father and cold to everyone in the way he was cold to everyone, which was to say that he was perfectly mannered and entirely unavailable, and he endured the visit for 2 days before Edmund pressed the matter he had come to press, which was the question of the autumn ball, and whether Marcus intended to present his wife to county society, and, if so, whether Marcus had considered the impression that presentation would make. "The impression," Marcus said at dinner on the second evening, "will be that I have a wife," which is accurate. "The impression," Edmund said, cutting his pheasant with a precision that made the action seem aggressive, "will be that you married a woman without family, fortune, or connection, for reasons that no one with sense will be able to explain, and that this household has consequently been placed in a position of social absurdity." He looked at Cecily with a smile that was technically polite. "No reflection on your personal qualities, my dear. The match simply defies comprehension." Cecily met his eyes and kept her voice level. "Many sensible decisions are initially difficult to comprehend from the outside," she said. "Understanding generally follows observation." Edmund looked at her for a moment, and she saw it. The brief recalibration of a man who had not expected resistance, and then the confidence reasserted itself. He turned back to his son. "The ball is in 3 weeks. I intend to be present. I trust you will consider carefully what the evening is likely to produce." He departed the following morning with Dorothea and Arabella, and the house settled back into its own rhythms. But the quality of the air had changed. Something had been started. Cecily understood this the way one understands a shift in the weather before the sky has changed color. The ball was held on the 14th of October in the great ballroom at Ashmore, which had been opened for the first time in 3 years, and which smelled faintly of beeswax and the particular cold sweetness of rooms that have been waiting. Mrs. Peel had supervised the preparations with the efficiency of a general who has been waiting for someone to give her a worthy campaign, and the room was lit by 400 candles and dressed with the last chrysanthemums from the walled garden. The county came, as the county always came to Ashmore, because the house was large, and the cellars were excellent, and the Duke's entertainments, when they occurred, were not to be missed. Cecily wore the deep green silk and her mother's pearl earrings, which were the one piece of jewelry she had kept from the trunk. Her hair was dressed by the lady's maid, Mrs. Peel had engaged on her behalf, a competent young woman named Kitty, who had managed, with pins and patience, to produce an arrangement that was elegant without being fashionable in a way that would date by next season. Marcus had looked at her when she came downstairs and said nothing, but his gaze had rested on her for a beat longer than was necessary, and the line of his jaw had shifted in a way she had learned, by this point, to read as something he was not yet going to say. They received their guests together, which was the first time they had stood side by side in a formal public context, and Cecily had felt the specific exposure of that position, the way the room's attention moved across them both and arrived at her and paused, assembling its verdict. She had kept her hands still and her shoulders back, and had greeted each guest by name where she knew it, and by title with specific courtesy where she did not, and by the time the receiving line was done, she thought perhaps the evening might pass without incident. Edmund had been present in the receiving line, smiling, courteous, and watchful. Dorothea had been positioned at his right hand like a piece of formal architecture. Arabella had worn white and diamonds, and had greeted Marcus with a warmth that was entirely correct and entirely deliberate. The ball reached its second hour. The violins played. The candles burned. Cecily stood near the long windows with a glass of negus she had not tasted, and Edmund raised his voice above the violins. What he said she had partly expected. What she had not expected was the particular precision of it, the way he assembled the facts of her life as though they were evidence, and presented them to the room with the confidence of a man reading from a parish register. The debt, the connection, the vicar's daughter. The match made out of spite, he said, not judgment, to obstruct a father's reasonable wishes, with no thought for the dignity of the family or the standing of the house. The room did what rooms do. It listened. Then it began, in small increments, to agree. Cecily heard it, the murmur that assembles itself from individual voices into a collective verdict, the sound of a judgment being formed. She heard a woman near the fireplace say, very quietly, "The vicar's orphan," and she recognized the phrase from the first ball of the season, the first time the label had been fastened to her name, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her by its lack of grief, that the season had simply come full circle. She looked at Marcus. He was 20 feet away, and his face was still, and he did not move. The silence he offered the room at that moment was the longest silence she had known inside this marriage, and it cost her something she had not known she could lose. She had not expected love from this arrangement. She had not permitted herself to expect it. But somewhere between the east corridor and the library and the garden path and the corridor outside, she had begun to expect, without quite naming it, to be valued. to be a person who had been observed and found to be worth the observing. She set down the untouched glass. She straightened her spine. She thought of her father, who had told her that a person of character behaves as such, regardless of whether anyone in the room is watching, and she crossed the floor toward Edmund, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the deliberate pace of a woman who has decided to say something and has decided also not to regret it. Edmund turned when she was 5 feet away, and the look on his face was that of a man who had not expected her to move. "Lord Vane," she said, in a voice that was clear enough to carry, but calm enough not to seem like a speech. "You have stated to this company that this marriage was contracted out of spite. I cannot speak to your son's reasons, which are his own. I can tell you what I have observed of this house in the 4 months I have lived in it." She paused, not for effect, but because she was choosing her next words with care. "I have observed a household in need of steadiness, and a child in need of patience, and a man in need of the particular kind of company that does not require anything from him except that he be himself. I did not come here expecting to value any of those things as much as I do. I came here to discharge a debt of £430 and to escape a marriage market that had no interest in what I could actually offer." She looked at Edmund steadily. "If that is spite, then spite has served this house better than judgment would have." The room was very quiet. Dorothea's fan had stopped moving. Edmund opened his mouth, and Marcus crossed the ballroom floor. He did not hurry. He covered the 20 feet in 3 strides, and the room parted for him with the automatic deference granted to a man of his size and rank, and the particular quality of his silence when it was purposeful. He came to stand beside Cecily, not in front of her, beside her, and he looked at his father for a moment that held everything the two of them had not said to each other for 3 years. "My wife," Marcus said, "has described this household more accurately in 4 sentences than you have managed in 4 months of interference." His voice was level. It did not rise. It did not need to. "She is the Duchess of Ashmore. This house is hers to manage. Thomas is in her care, and he is better for it than he has been since his father died. Those are the only facts this company requires." Edmund said, "Marcus, the circumstances of this match are known to everyone in this room, and the pretense that it is anything other than what it is does not serve the family's dignity." "The circumstances of this match," Marcus said, "are that I made a choice, for reasons I will not explain to you or to this room, and that the choice has proven to be the most accurate judgment I have made in 3 years." He paused. A single beat. "That is all." It was not a long speech. It was not a declaration of love in the terms that the assembled county might have expected or wished for. It was shorter and quieter and more specific than that, and it was irrevocable, and every person in the room who had spent the last 10 minutes agreeing with Edmund Vane heard it recalibrate. Dorothea's fan remained still. Her face, for the first time that evening, showed something that was not quite performance. A brief private recognition, quickly suppressed, of a person who understands that a verdict has been reversed in a place that cannot be taken back. Mrs. Peel was standing near the doorway at the far end of the room, having come to oversee the supper arrangements, and when a gentleman near her said, in a bewildered undertone, that he supposed the woman was unknown to the household, Mrs. Peel said, with a quiet directness that required no elaboration, "She is known to this household, sir. She is known very well." Arabella turned and walked to the far side of the room with a composed grace that was the only dignity the evening had left her. And Edmund found, in the quarter hour that followed, that his audience had redistributed itself, and that the county's attention was no longer available to be aimed. He departed before supper was served, with Dorothea at his arm, and he did not, that evening or afterward, attempt another arrangement on his son's behalf. Cecily stood beside Marcus in the ballroom after the guests had resumed their conversations, and the violins had started again, and the candles burned on. And she said nothing, because there was, for the moment, nothing that needed to be said. He was standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through the silk of her gown, and his hand came to rest, very lightly, at the small of her back, which was the first time he had touched her since the garden, and she did not step away. "I did not plan it," he said quietly, for her ears only, "any further than the pavement outside the Greenfields ball. I planned precisely as far as obstructing my father, and no further." "I know," she said. "I find I have planned considerably further since." She looked up at him. His face had changed, not dramatically, not in any way the room could have easily named, but the mask that she had learned to read in pieces, the set of his jaw, the careful economy of his expression, had shifted into something that was still recognizably him and no longer closed. "So have I," she said. The first snow came 3 weeks later. It arrived overnight, as November snow will without announcement, and Cecily woke to find the grounds of Ashmore Park transformed into a quiet white expanse that muffled every sound and made the long avenue of elms look like a painting of themselves. She dressed and went downstairs and found Thomas already at the window in the breakfast room, his breath fogging the glass, watching the snow with the specific intensity of a child who has not yet decided whether to be delighted or afraid of something new. She sat down beside him. "Have you seen snow before?" she asked. "At school," he said. "It was cold." "It is generally cold," she agreed. "Would you like to go out in it?" He considered this for a long moment, and she did not press him. Then he said, "Will you come too?" "Yes," she said. "I will come too." They put on their coats and their boots and went out through the kitchen door into the white morning, and Thomas ran ahead of her down the path toward the orchard, and his footprints were neat and purposeful in the snow. And when he turned back to look at her, she saw, for the first time, the smile that had been living somewhere beneath his careful stillness all these months, sudden and unguarded and completely his own. And she thought of his father on a battlefield she had never seen, and his uncle in a house he had not been able to save. And she was grateful for the cold air, which gave her an honest reason for whatever was in her eyes. Marcus was standing at the drawing-room window when she came back in, and he had been watching. He met her at the door and took her cold hands in his and held them. And the fire in the grate was burning well, and the smell of it was the smell of every winter morning she had spent in a house that was home. And she thought, with a quiet that held nothing aching in it, that she had not expected to find this here. She had expected to endure. She had planned as far as the debt retired, and the season escaped. She had not planned for the East Corridor, and the study, and the child's footprints in the snow, and she had not planned for the man standing in front of her, with her cold hands in his warm ones, looking at her with a face that had finally finished performing its distance. She went upstairs that afternoon and found herself standing in the East Corridor, and she lifted the portrait of Catherine down from where it had been turned, and she carried it to the study and set it on the shelf by the window, where the winter light would fall on it properly. And she wrote a small card and placed it beneath the frame that said, simply, "The first Duchess of Ashmore," because Catherine had been here first and deserved to be named. When Marcus came in and found it there, he stood in the doorway for a long moment without speaking. Then he crossed the room and looked at the portrait for the first time in 3 years, and his hand came up and rested briefly on the frame. and she watched him say whatever it was he needed to say to her in the silence that belongs to people who are finished punishing themselves. He turned and looked at Cecily. She did not say anything. She did not need to. That evening, Thomas fell asleep on the drawing room sofa while Cecily was reading aloud, his head against the armrest and his small hands folded under his cheek. And Marcus lifted him and carried him upstairs. And when he came back down, the fire had settled into its low, steady warmth, and the snow outside the window was still coming, fine and quiet against the dark. He sat beside her. She did not move away. After a time he said, "I did not know what I was building when I started it. I only knew I was tired of the alternative." She understood him exactly. She put her hand into his, and the fire crackled, and the snow fell on Ashmore Park, and the portrait of Catherine stood on its shelf in the study where it could finally be seen, and the debt was long since paid, all 430 pounds of it, every penny. And the only account still open between them was the one neither of them had planned for, and both of them, in their separate careful ways, had come to count on. She was home. She had not expected that at the start of it. She was home, and it was sufficient. And it was more. If Cecily's quiet journey moved you, leave a word below for your favorite moment. This story was made for the listeners who stay until the last candle.